A ray of hope that the Hong Kong Marathon may take place in February next year. John Lee says the government is looking into the possibility of relaxing quarantine arrangements for inbound travelers. And Ukraine accuses Russia of firing a missile at the vicinity of a nuclear power plant in the south of the country. Good evening and welcome to TVB News. The Hong Kong Marathon could be set to be rescheduled for next February after the organizer had previously announced the cancellation of this year's event. However, the organizer didn't mention the maximum number of participants that would be allowed to participate in the race should it go ahead in early 2023. Christy Khan has details.
The organizer of the Hong Kong Marathon, the Hong Kong Association of Athletics Affiliates, or HKAAA, announced today that the event could be held on February 12 next year. The marathon was originally scheduled to take place this November. Last Friday, the organizer announced that the race would not go ahead as they still hadn't received government approval. But the association said in a statement today they have received the government's full support to plan to hold a marathon next year after having had discussion with multiple parties over the past few days. The organizer also said they will strictly adhere to and implement all necessary anti-pandemic measures so that runners, staff and the public can participate in the event in a safe and healthy manner. But the organizer didn't mention the maximum number of participants that would be allowed to compete in next year's marathon. Commissioner for Sports Yuan Tak-kun meanwhile clarified why the authorities didn't grant immediate approval for the HKAAA to host the event.
We received the proposal from the Hong Kong AAA on the 7th of September. And up to last week, we were still processing the application. And the number of participants in the proposal was 25,000. It takes time for the relevant government departments to consider the proposal and advise on the necessary precautionary measures.
Speaking to reporters before the weekly Executive Council meeting this morning, Chief Executive John Lee said the government will try its best to communicate with different parties and make sure large-scale events can take place in Hong Kong.
Of course, we will be doing all our best so that we will be having all these events to happen in Hong Kong. Our position is very clear. We are very supportive, and we want both sides to work towards the goal of making it happen. So we will have to openly and directly talk to each other so as to try a good solution for Hong Kong.
He added these events can bring economic gains to the city. Christy Khan, TVB News.
Chief Executive John Lee says the SAR government is actively studying the subject of relaxation of quarantine arrangements for inbound travelers. Lee also said Hong Kong remains very competitive despite the measures.
With more calls coming from the community urging the government to scrap hotel quarantine and replace it with 7 days of home isolation for inbound travellers, Chief Executive John Lee said he will make a decision very soon.
While we will do our best to control the epidemic, we aim to have the maximum connection with the international world and also to reduce the inconvenience to people who arrive at Hong Kong. And I am trying all our best to ensure that we don't roll back any measures that we are doing. As we progress to allow more activities, we do it in an orderly way.
Yet, Hong Kong continues to face a talent drain while losing opportunities to host major events to the city's competitor, Singapore. John Lee said he understands the SAR's current COVID rules are affecting the way it connects with other parts of the world, but insisted the city remains competitive.
After so many turmoil in the past, Hong Kongers have displayed our resilience. We have a very quality workforce. Our system is competitive. In many areas, we rank among the top in the world. Of course, there are lots of different challenges that we are facing. With our united efforts, we can overcome these difficulties.
Currently, incoming travelers are required to do both PCR tests and RATs after they arrive and wait for their results on their way to quarantine hotels. Authorities are reportedly looking into whether travelers will only be allowed to leave the airport after testing negative if the city pushes ahead with 7 days of home isolation. Lawmaker Michael Tian said the cost of doing PCR tests is too high.
In the long run, I think they should cancel the PCR and just do direct. The argument is simple. These are people that have not been confirmed to be infected, nor are they close contact. But in Hong Kong today, if you are a close contact of an infected person, you don't have to do PCR.
Meanwhile, Ricky Chiu, the operator of a testing contractor, said the laboratory set up at the airport may struggle to handle a sharp increase in the number of travelers as it has limited space and manpower.
Hong Kong's COVID caseload continued to decline, continuing the trend of the past few days. Today, the city reported 5,594 infections, including 135 imported cases. It's the first time that the number of infections has fallen below the 6,000 mark since mid-August. Meanwhile, the government announced the current social distancing measures will remain until October the 5th. Christy Khan reports.
Despite the recent trend of declining daily COVID cases tallies in Hong Kong, health officials said in a press conference today that the authorities are still monitoring the city's coronavirus situation before further relaxing existing anti-COVID measures.
The pandemic seems to be slowing down. The government is continue its monitoring on the trend to see whether measures could be relaxed.
But health officials reiterated that the city is still in its fifth wave of the pandemic, and they hope that the downward trend can continue. As for new cases, a 2-year-old boy infected with COVID had been admitted to hospital. The boy's viral load was high and he wasn't conscious after his admission.
He was suffering from upper respiratory symptoms when he was admitted into hospital after admission, so some medication had to be used to help with his seizure. He also had breathing difficulties, therefore the ICU took him in.
The toddler was suspected to have hydrocephalus, an abnormal buildup of fluid in the brain. The boy had received his first COVID shot last month. Health officials called on parents to get their children vaccinated as soon as possible. There were 1,007 positive cases reported across 589 schools today. 28 schools are required to suspend some classes for a week. The city registered 7 more COVID-related deaths. One of the deceased was unvaccinated. Christy Khan, TVB News.
Former Chief Secretary for Administration Henry Tang has suggested that Hong Kong should drop the quarantine requirement for travellers who are fully vaccinated. Tang, who is currently the chairman of the West Kowloon Cultural District Authority, also said on a TVB program that the M+ Museum has so far received 1.5 million visitors.
With most countries that are Hong Kong's business partners and competitors opening up as the COVID pandemic eases, the debate is heating up as to how the SAR should further relax its quarantine rules. Former Chief Secretary for Administration Henry Tang said on a TVB program that the city should drop its quarantine requirement for travellers who are fully vaccinated.
If we make a differentiation about vaccination, so that those who are fully vaccinated will be able to basically come in and out very freely with certain tests again. I think Hong Kong Center as a regional headquarter, Center for Exhibitions, Center for Food and Beverage, and Center for other businesses will come back very quickly.
Tang earlier said Hong Kong will be suffering from internal bleeding if its economy only relies on internal circulation.
Hong Kong has always relied ourselves on being a regional center for managing businesses all around Asia. And we are losing that advantage. And Singapore has been very strategically poaching our people, poaching our businesses, and poaching some of the regional headquarters as well as important exhibitions.
But the pandemic has apparently not stopped visitors to our new museums. Tang, who is the chairman of the West Kowloon Cultural District Authority, said the M+ Museum had already received 1.5 million guests and the Palace Museum 400,000 visitors in just 2 months. He revealed the next cultural facility to open will be the Lyric Theatre.
The building will finish sometime next year, 23-24, and then with the internal fittings and all the testing out, it's a very, very complicated project because there's an MTR rail running underneath it.
Tang added that Hong Kong should nurture local talents as well as invite foreign talents to exhibit their works in the museums.
Overseas, Ukrainian authorities said a Russian missile struck close to a nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine without damaging the 3 reactors but hitting other industrial equipment. Elsewhere, senior U.S. Biden administration officials briefed American lawmakers on Ukraine as the European Union's foreign policy chief outlined the bloc's stance on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Daniel Rao tells us more.
A Russian missile reportedly made impact within 300 meters of the 3 reactors at the South Ukraine nuclear power plant. Ukrainian authorities said it blasted a crater 2 meters deep and 4 meters across, but the reactors were operating normally and no staff members were injured. The nuclear power station, also known as the Pivden-Ukrainsk plant, is Ukraine's second largest after the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is being occupied by Russia and has repeatedly come under fire during the conflict. Both Moscow and Kyiv have accused each other of the shelling of the facility. Following recent battlefield setbacks, Russian President Vladimir Putin threatened to ramp up attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure as Russian forces continue to pound other sites. Ukraine's presidential office said the latest Russian shelling killed at least 8 civilians, wounding 22 others. Meanwhile, in his nightly video address, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Moscow was palpably panicking as Ukraine continued its counteroffensive that has reclaimed towns and cities from Russian troops. Zelensky said Kyiv was stabilizing the situation in the northeastern Kharkiv region, which is now largely back in Ukrainian hands. Still, civic chambers in the self-proclaimed republics of Luhansk and Donetsk called on the Kremlin-backed heads of their regions to hold referendums on joining Russia. Officials have discussed such plans before. However, the referendums have been repeatedly delayed. There have been suggestions that such referendums could take place on November 4th, when Russia marks the National Unity Day. Elsewhere in the US, senior Biden administration members briefed American lawmakers on Ukraine. Speaking to reporters after the classified briefing, Republican Senator Richard Scott commented on the Democrats' plans to provide Ukraine with further weapon supplies.
I think we've got to do whatever we can to make sure that Russian, goes back home and make sure that they never invade NATO territory.
And speaking during a security conference at the United Nations ahead of the UN General Assembly later this week, the European Union's Foreign Affairs chief reiterated the bloc's stance on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Josep Borrell said Russia must cease its occupation of the plant immediately. He added that Brussels supports the establishment of a nuclear safety and security protection zone around the plant. Daniel Rowe, TVB News.
A magnitude 7.6 earthquake struck western Mexico on Monday on the anniversary of 2 devastating tremors which hit the country in 1985 and 2017. At least 2 people have been killed as buildings and power lines were damaged. The quake hit shortly after 1 p.m. local time. Its epicenter was located close to the border between the states of Michoacan and Colima. In the capital, Mexico City, a seismic alert was activated as people took to the streets in a bid to avoid potentially collapsing buildings. The 2 casualties were recorded in the major Pacific port of Manzanillo, which is located in Michoacan. Damage to several hospitals near the epicenter was also reported. The quake was relatively shallow at only 15 kilometers deep. Scientists believe this could have amplified its impact. The U.S. Pacific Tsunami Warning Center issued a warning for coastal areas following the trauma. Afghanistan's Taliban rulers yesterday freed an American engineer in exchange for a Taliban-linked Afghan tribal leader. This came after U.S. President Joe Biden granted clemency to Bashir Nurzai, a Taliban associate convicted in a heroin trafficking conspiracy who had spent 17 years behind bars in America. Mark Farich is an engineer abducted in 2020 while working in Afghanistan. He was exchanged at Kabul airport for Nurzai. Nurzai is considered as a key associate to the founder of Taliban, Mullah Omar. Nurzai was detained on charges of smuggling more than $50 million worth of heroin into the U.S. and Europe. In September 2008, he was found guilty following a jury trial in New York and sentenced to life in prison in 2009. The Biden administration has been under pressure from the families of Americans detained by hostile foreign governments. Still to come on tonight's news. Queen Elizabeth II laid in final resting place in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. And Typhoon Nanmaro heads north towards the Tokyo area. And themed garden plots in 18 districts around town. Welcome back to TVB News. In Britain, Queen Elizabeth II was laid to rest at St. George's Chapel on the grounds of Windsor Castle on Monday. She was buried alongside her husband, Prince Philip, who died last year. Her family attended a final service after a state funeral earlier in the day that had been attended by more than 100 heads of state and royalty from around the world. Tracy Furness has more.
After the Queen's state funeral at Westminster Abbey Monday and a final procession through the British capital, the Queen's coffin was taken on a 30-mile drive south of London to Windsor Castle by hearse. Tens of thousands of people lined the long walk outside Windsor Castle to pay their respects to the late monarch as she came home for the last time.
It was incredible, the sort of solemnity of watching all of the, the pageantry and all of the military parade and so on. But then just, a grandmother, a mother, on her, making her last journey. So really moving, and just great to be here.
Oh, it's very moving. Days like this, I'm proud to be British for sure. Yes. I just felt I had to be here. It's just a gut instinct that I had to be here.
As the hearse entered the castle, senior members of the royal family, led by King Charles, joined the procession as it approached St. George's Chapel. A committal service was held at St. George's Chapel for Queen Elizabeth, with family and friends in attendance.
As with grateful hearts, we reflect on these.
The Dean of Windsor read a psalm, and the Queen's coffin was lowered into the chapel's royal vaults. Later that evening, the royals held a private service at the chapel as the Queen was interred together with her late husband, Prince Philip, who died last year at the age of 99. Queen Elizabeth's late parents, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, are also interred there alongside the ashes of the Queen's sister, Princess Margaret. The conclusion of the commemorations also marked the end of 10 days of national mourning across the UK. The royal family's mourning period will continue until September 26. Tracy Furness, TVB News.
Typhoon Nanmaro, one of the biggest storms to hit Japan in years, has left at least 2 people dead and brought record rainfall to the west of the country on Monday. The storm has now swerved north towards Tokyo. Residential streets were flooded with muddy water from rivers, and many homes lost power after Typhoon Nanmaro made landfall in the Kyushu region Sunday. A man was found dead early Monday in his car that was submerged in water on a farm. More than 60 people were injured during the storm. According to Japan Meteorological Agency, the typhoon has sustained winds of 108 kilometers per hour and gusts of up to 162 kilometers per hour. The State Council's Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office has dismissed allegations that the city has become more like the Chinese mainland following the implementation of the national security law. Deputy Director of the office, Huang Liuquan, made the comments at a Beijing press briefing on the successful implementation of one country, two systems. He said it's inappropriate for people to say that Hong Kong is experiencing an immigration wave or talent drain. Huang also said Hong Kong is an international city and that it is politically biased to say that the city becoming more like the mainland after the national security law took effect. The Leisure and Cultural Services Department has installed themed garden plots in 18 districts around town to bring colour to the city. The flowers are blossoming in Po Hong Park in Tseung Kwan O, as well as Hong Kong Park and 16 other locations around town. These garden plots are the last phase of exhibitions in the Blossom Around Town scheme. That's to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the SAR's return to Chinese rule. The public has until the 16th of next month to soak in the beautiful scenery. That's the news. Thanks for watching.